thank you. It's a little bigger crowd than I was thinking I'd get. So again, I've got the sort of standard problem here of who do I pitch this to? The people who really, really need the talk, who won't see it, or the people who are in the room. But kind of the idea here is based on reading about 6,000 odd tickets, a lot of which have patches. Certain problems come up again and again, and I'm absolutely not going to crap on anybody's code here. Like, no one gets mentioned by name. There's actually no bad code shown here except by people who've given me permission. So don't feel bad if you've submitted a patch and something else got committed to Django. You're not going to suddenly see your name in a couple of slides. You're very safe. But I want to sort of give some general ideas of what's going on here. Code quality really does matter, particularly for an open source project. Probably everyone in this room has at some point in their life, and even most of us doing it now, are writing code for a living. Maybe in small commercial environments where there's you and a team of 4, 6, 8 other people. You get away with a lot of stuff in those environments because you have to get it out, like money matters. You are working with a small team, you can all agree to just hold your nose and get on with this, or habit set in. You saw the stuff yesterday from Adrian's keynote about various things that he and Simon and Jacob did that right now, if someone tried to submit that code to Django, there'd probably be laughter, right? But it seemed like the right thing at the time, and it takes a while to realize we've just gone off the rails a little bit. But in an open source project, it really is kind of important that you get it right, because everyone sees your code. It's not just in your corporate environment. It's not a case where you sell the code and people are just going to see it. It's out there. It's on Google. You search for your name. It actually shows up in authors files and messages and stuff like that. You go to Google Code and search for your name. It's in every project you've ever committed to. You have to get it right, which means we're allowed to take our time. That's why we don't have really, really hard deadlines. It's actually worth taking your time and getting it right. So something that fixes a bug will actually be rejected if it sucks. Even though it fixes the bug, even though that bug interrupts 5,000 people, if it's a really, really major show-stopping bug, we'll probably just hold our noses and commit something for a while. But for most things, we're going to get it right before we get it closed. Right at the start of this, let's get the really Mickey Mouse stuff out of the way. You've got to get it right on a sort of fundamental level. Like, you've got to actually... Well, the sort of basic rule is it's kind of a good idea if your patch fixes more bugs than it introduces, for a start. But at the open source level, that's not even an option. You kind of got to introduce no bugs at all. But there are bigger things than that. There's a whole bunch of tickets that arrive where someone was finally relieved. It runs, right? The case they've got is fixed. But before you send us your patch, have a look at it and just check for a few, like the obvious stuff, right? Is it syntactically correct? Is the word print still in there? Rob Lofthouse says he sees this all the time at his work. PDB is often in commit messages, is in patches going through into Subversion. Again, unless you're writing Django admin.py, there is no reason in the world for print to be in your code, right? You forgot to take out the debugging stuff. If your code introduces a fix me comment, we're probably going to wonder why it's there. Like, unless it's really, really hard or we've agreed beforehand, yes, this should go in just as is, it's not a finished patch unless if it's got fix me or must do this or something. You got to have a test. Because otherwise Russell gets really foamy and posts a comment in Track every now and again about why isn't there a test. But it's actually a good idea. Our test suite is cool. It hits every line of code, well, not every line of code, but it hits the majority of stuff. It's very comforting to know that if I'm refactoring some large portion of code and I run the test suite and it passes, I probably haven't messed up in a way that's going to affect many people. What it actually does is raises the bar for introducing bugs. When I introduce a bug now, it's a really, really tricky bug that takes ages to find. But at least you got to get through the test suite. And yeah, it takes 35 minutes, 40 minutes maybe, an hour to run the test suite. You've got time on your hands. We want to change run tests to actually print out. This may take it some time. Have you thought of writing some documentation? Because at that point, you're there, you're waiting. We're working on making the test suite faster, but it's still not an excuse. Run it, go have dinner, come back, check. And introducing a test if you're fixing a problem is probably a good idea. Most tickets include a patch, include a failing, like I tried this, it failed. But this is often long or involved or something. Trim it down to the bare minimum. Like, the smallest test you can come up with is better. The really good patches are like, I've included a test and I've got to run through the patch about 3 times to find the test because it's actually only 3 lines. That's an awesome test because unless it's really, really tricky, you can understand what it's doing in 1 line. It's clearly testing only one thing. How many things can you test in 3 lines of code? And ideally, in fact, necessarily, it fails beforehand and passes afterwards. The reverse is really, really bad. Your patch is wrong. But some people say, here's a test and look, it passes. And I don't apply the patch and I do apply the test and it still passes. What are you trying to prove? You wrote a test, okay? Put that in a different patch. You're not testing your patch. And you know, PEP 8, the style guide for Python, read it. We like it. We'll insist. Okay, what we don't insist though, very early on in PEP 8, it says important is that your code looks like the other code that you're writing. Above all else, follow the style of the code around it. So there are some things we do that later on, that contradict things later on in PEP 8, or if you run pep8.py over your code, which is a very good thing to do, by the way, it's going to spit out things. Partly that's because the guy who wrote pep8.py has opinions and they're different from some of ours, but partly because we just do some things that are not in PEP 8. Go back to paragraph 1. It says, follow the code that's around there. I can't remember the exact quote, but don't send us patches that are like, it's not like PEP 8. Here, I'll fix them for you. Because, thank you, but unless there's an actual bug, we're just going to leave it. We might tidy it up when we're in the area. But some of it's stylistic. But at least read that and try and follow along. Where there's any sort of choice, our functions, our class names, our comments, all of that follows sort of PEP 8 guidelines. Yeah, all right, this is just, there's an hour-long talk behind this slide, but seriously, right, how hard can it be to submit a patch to track and get it right? At least get the, here's a patch. Firstly, it's called a patch. It's not called a complete file. So we want to see the changes. We can review patches. Track has a very nice view the patch sort of screen, view the diff. It even colors it in for us. I can review a lot of patches on that screen. And okay, track has some bugs that sometimes it doesn't show the diff, and so I'll have to download it. But my editor is also really good at coloring a diff. So I can see you change this, you alter this. And sometimes I look at it and it's sort of Technicolor mosaic of additions and subtractions, and then I've got to actually apply it and, you know, try it out. A lot of patches get rejected without even having to be applied. And I can't be I'm speaking for myself here, but I can't be the only person who does this. You can read a patch and you know the code well enough, you can see this has no chance. Sometimes you're wrong, but usually a patch is a good thing. It shows us exactly what you're changing. And if you're writing a patch, and sometimes you've had a few shots, again, make sure, try and clean up the code. And understand, I'm giving this talk as a you should or you must, but I'm really saying this is what we've seen, and maybe no one in this room is guilty of this. You've all submitted perfect patches and you're just here for the laughs. But there's not going to be any laughs. It's a sad topic, right? Do a proper patch. Don't send me the stuff that you also changed some white space over here or you fixed a spelling error. Yeah, that's nice, and maybe I'll even do it sometimes, but just patch the thing you're changing, because random Joe submits patch to Django track. We don't know who you are. You have to pass the bozo filter, right? If we know who you are, you have, like, if I see a patch from some guy called Jacob, there's a chance it gets through no matter what, because, hey, I know the guy on the other side of that name. But I see a patch from random guy, the bozo bit is on until proved otherwise, and I'm looking for a reason to say no, really. Like, it's going to be a good reason, but it could be has not mastered the basics of SVN diff, is possibly, please, you're just going to get a comment saying, thanks for this, could you, try again, give me a patch. Start from the top of the tree when you do SVN diff too. There's nothing more fun than, here's a patch against __init ___py. Awesome, we got a few of those files in the tree. Sometimes you can work it out from the context, but don't make me think. Anyone here ever submitted a translation to Django? Translation patch of any nature? You guys suck, seriously, right? You can't all just speak English. Honza, you speak funny languages. Send us a patch. All right, he's claiming he corrected some things, but he didn't send us a patch, right? I mean, even translators should actually, I've got a big beef at the moment. Translators are really bad at getting into their heads. Patches are good. SVN diff works for you guys too, right? Don't send me a whole update of Django.po or Django.js.po. And seriously, guys, you've got to speak some foreign languages. Send us translation updates. The Welsh need you. It's down at like 23% at the moment. Something that people don't realize when they do a new patch, when they are writing new files, svn add actually works even if you don't have commit access to the tree. You can go svn add in your local thing, so then svn diff will actually include the new file. Sometimes that actually took me quite a while when I'd been doing open source stuff for a while and switched to Subversion to realize that I don't have to send the extra file, like a new, and here's a file to add or something. It sometimes struggles with empty files. I think init.pys that are empty gets left off, but that's okay. We'll handle that. But svn add does work locally, so that's worth remembering if you're adding a new file. It kind of comes back to what I said before. PEP8 has some wriggle room. In fact, it has an enormous, huge disclaimer at the top that whatever's there is right, and you should adjust to that. But there are some opinions about how the code gets laid out, and if you're contributing to something like Django that has round figure 100,000 lines of code, plus all this documentation and so on, probably best that you stick to what we're doing rather than ask us to stick to the other way around, right? Yeah, stuff in Django is different to what I would do in my own code sometimes. Bad luck. When I'm writing for Django, well, it's not bad luck. It's just there are opinions and they differ. And they're not necessarily right or wrong. That's why they're called opinions. You have to adjust to what we're doing. Write it in the style of Django. I don't mean I'm fixing a bug, I should put one in. I mean, no, the code style. We got this really awesome document, contributing.txt. Unfortunately, in the docs refactor, it's really well hidden too. I wanted to put the URL up there, but the wall isn't actually long enough. It's like docs.djangoproject.com/en/dev/internal/contributing, I think. URLs don't wrap well on a slide. Just, look on the front page of docs.djangoproject.com, go to internal and go to contributing, and read it. Adrian even went through at one point and started putting in like a style guide, like email has, I can't remember. You think I should know this, shouldn't you? Email, I think, has a hyphen when we use it, and these words are capitalized and these words aren't. But also the order we put the methods in a model, like we sort of, if you're going to put a meta, it comes after your fields and so on. So if you're writing example code or if you're writing a models.py that's going into Django, get it in the right order. It's missing a few things. I know I was doing something the other day and I had to actually, I actually looked at what did contributing.txt say, and it didn't, so I have to go and fix that. I don't think it specifies where we put managers in the order or something, Adrian. We should probably fix before or after meta. It looked wrong either way. So anyway, we have this document. It's not as bad as like Subversion has one that's like 89 pages long or something. Our one, you print it out, it's maybe 5-6 pages, but it covers a lot. It covers like where to send security issues, how to contribute patches, what the triage process looks like. If any of it is unfamiliar to you, that's bad for contributing to a project. So yeah, read it. It takes an hour if you take notes. It takes less time if you just go fast, but it's there for a reason. It's just that we have contributing.txt so that we can hit people with it. In terms of, you didn't do what we said in contributing.txt, so yeah, we really like your patch. Could you actually try and do it so that we can apply it? The next thing is, again, sort of code quality. And there's code that's correct and well formatted and stylistic and everything. But then you've got to think, well, okay, this code is going to be, again, it's pictures of you in your underwear. It's got to look good. It's got to last. Now, this is pretty good code. It was perfectly correct. I think it was even wrapped in a try except statement. It's from a proprietary thing, but I have permission to use this particular line. But you can sort of see in isolation, it has maybe, if you read it out loud to yourself, it certainly alliterates well, but it's maybe a little bit confusing what's going on. Fortunately, the person who wrote this code did the right thing. It's well commented. So, and all right, once you've realized that's the situation, you can never change that line of code, right? You don't actually relabel that. But Django doesn't have the word funniest anywhere in the source. So you've got to name things well so that other people can read it. Don't be too clever. At some point, Adrian did a very good veto of something on Django Dev that we weren't going to use separate as a method name, because separate is really hard to spell, even in English, right? Is it 2 A's, 2 E's? What order they go in, right? And more than half the people who access DjangoProject.com web server have something other than English set as the first language, preferred language in their browser. That means that a lot of our users, maybe the majority of our users, don't know English. So if you're putting in a word that's hard to spell in English as a method name, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Russians are really not your friends at this point. So Use easy-to-use words. Use words that aren't ambiguous, because sometimes if you're using strings and whatnot, they've got to be translated. I don't really like answering questions like, how do I have to translate, how does factory translate? There's a big debate going on in a ticket, well, big debate, tiny debate going on in a ticket about how should website be translated in German, because there's sort of a literal version and a sort of just translating it as website and so on, because some of these technical words are hard. But even method names, developers have to use them. Be nice to your people who can't spell separate and things like that. Comments obviously should be included. That was when you read PEP 8, you learned about that. But comments should actually last. They should be more relevant than, we were having a lot of trouble with this, or this is tricky, is a comment that's absolutely appropriate at the moment the commit message goes in, and possibly even extends a bit further than just the person who wrote the patch. The other people might realize it was tricky because there's been a huge thread on Django Dev. Is that comment going to make sense 18 months from now, when someone who didn't see the original thread reads it? This is tricky, thanks. All you're saying is I'm screwed. You're not telling me what I have to watch out for. A comment should actually explain the problem and why we're doing this. If it's really complicated, sometimes it'll just be a reference to a ticket number. We're doing this because of short summary, see also ticket number. We kind of, well, I don't know. I say we, but I may be on shaky ground here. I at least try to avoid doing that as much as possible, because I read a lot of code when I'm not attached to the net. So ticket 7380, whilst I might remember it if I wrote the patch, I'm not actually going to remember what was in 7380 or why it was tricky. And someone else might not either, particularly if 7380 has 37 comments. So just write comments that are timely, they're going to last. Above that, this is a bonus. Thank you, your code is very well commented. It doesn't match the code. This should never fail is always my favorite sort of comment. It's almost you basically search for that in the code. You just know that's where I need to wrap try excepts around stuff, because it'll fail. More importantly there, if you're changing code and there's a bit of a comment block above it, check the comment block. It was often referring to the previous code, and it may refer to something subtly that you actually need to change because you've now changed the code. This is not invalidly viewed as a bit of a drawback of really heavily commented code. You're essentially writing the code twice, once in English and once in Python. And every time you change the Python, you've also got to change the English. It's why you don't put a comment saying I is I plus 1, because now if you actually change I equals I plus 1, you've got to go and change the comment. Aside from the comment being really distracting. But when you put a comment in, sometimes you actually have to change the code to match it. That's a fairly common error that's made, and you don't see it when you're reviewing a patch, because you don't see until it's in context that, hey, there's actually a comment up the top or a docstring. I'm really bad at that. I'm getting better because I know it's a big weakness in my code that I forget to change even docstrings or comments that I wrote, because they were actually 3 lines further up, and I have the attention span of a seagull. I'm fixing this bit, not up here. But I now remember this is actually something I do wrong, so it's on the list. Don't be like me. Ah, yes, this is my favorite. We've now moved beyond, shoulds and silly errors. This is actually hard. It's very easy. The sort of real world analogy here is, I heard a crash outside my room and there was lots of screaming, so I closed the door and the noise stopped. Yeah, you fix the symptom, not the problem at that point, right? It's the same in bugs. It's very easy to, when I apply this patch, the problem goes away. And we'll often look at the ticket and go, agreed, correct, meets all of the style criterion, probably doesn't fix the problem. There's sort of often just a smell that, this is doing the wrong thing. And then someone else will go, yes, it fixes it for me too. I've seen this, it fixes, why hasn't this been applied yet? You guys suck. And you've got to fix the problem. Sometimes you just have a feeling this isn't really fixing the problem. It feels way too isolated. It's a validation problem, but it's in the admin. That probably means it's actually somewhere else. Or there's a problem of the wrong type is being passed through to the database. So if I just fix it over here in the admin, it'll be fine. Or if I change this data, more importantly, that one happens in reverse. I'll loosen up the database constraints, and now the admin works. Well, why is the admin passing the wrong type through in the first place? Particularly things like, I needed to loosen up constraints to make this work. That's a real symptom fixing smell, because all you're doing is basically loosening the speed limit so people can drive faster, because too many people were getting arrested due to speeding. you've got to actually look at the problem. Why is the wrong type coming through? Why was it considered at one point acceptable that we constrained this and now it's a much broader type? Okay, maybe it is a bug, but you've got to have a lot of reasoning there. I think I just did that slide. That's what that means. But a couple of examples. So I think I saw Uzi in the audience before. I think the person who reported this ticket may actually be in the audience here. This is kind of one of about 45 examples I actually had in a list, and I'm only going to use one of them. Someone reported fairly clearly, template code below will cause an infinite memory heaping loop. It's pretty simple templating code, right? This sort of catches your attention. Uncool. Now, the main thing here is he was doing something dumb. You weren't meant to pass through just this permissions thing. You were meant to. It's a different sort of object that you're not meant to iterate over. But as pointed out, and I got to say, the guy who reported this used to be a Linux kernel developer. He actually has some skills at reporting bugs. My main issue was incredibly hard to debug. I'll buy that. It's actually worth fixing, right? It ate my memory, and I had no idea why. We're already wrong twice at this point. First guy applied a quick, I've sort of dotted out the rest of it because I need to fit on a slide, but it basically was this quick fix, this at least allowed me to debug it. Someone else came along and thought they do a better job, and I'm not really, if you actually look at the ticket, you can see what the second one is, but I'm not at all giving crap to the guy who wrote the second patch on this ticket, because he actually tried to say, let's do this comprehensively, let's document it, let's handle all the cases, really polish the edges. It was a pretty good patch as far as things went. It changed a lot of stuff. So you sort of look at this and you go, like I've just said, okay, here's the 3 files that changed, and it sort of changed a bunch of lines in each file. It sort of had that smell that, this seems a lot of code to change just for that problem. Like maybe he's really dived in and he's actually problem fixing. Now, this one actually got fixed with Jacob and I sitting around Jacob's lounge room at one point and living room and just looking at it and going, this just can't be right. What's going on here? Turns out in Python, if you've got an object that has a get item, __ get item, and no __ len, it's a really bad idea to try and turn it into a list or an iterator unless you've taken special methods, because it just keeps calling get item. Get item kept returning stuff. The final patch that went in was actually basically the same as the original patch. And this is it, right? There's no more off the bottom of the screen here. Plus, Jacob we recently had removed one of his literary quotes from the source code, so he got to put one back in. There's a Whitman quote down the bottom there. But really, this is a much preferred patch over something that changes documentation and adds 14 methods to things to special case it, because it really just catches the root cause. This thing really isn't meant to be iterable. If you accidentally try, and there's nothing to suggest you should iterate over it. If you accidentally try to do this, let's just raise a really big error. The message is kind of clear what's going on there. Don't do that. And that actually took a lot longer than we thought. We were about to apply the original patch, and it's really not good, it's really not good. We actually took time. It took 2 people about an hour to sort of come up with, be happy with a bit of back and forth debate. I mean, that wasn't all we were doing for an hour. There was a lot of joking around and stuff on other things, but it took a little while to get to that point. Plus, I think Jacob had to go and look up the quote. But this is a bit of a symptom fixing case as well. You fix it, you've carefully researched, I completely understand this problem and I fixed it, and it's never going to reoccur in that place. It's a little bit hard to say where else does it happen in 100,000 lines of code, but I'm also trying to convince people here, don't just fix trivial patches, right? It's kind of good to move on and help us fix those big ticket items that turn out to be the 200 lines of code changed because we had to change them, not because your code was really verbose. Have a look around. And here where I really do crap on somebody, but it's me, so it's okay. This can actually be a lot harder than it looks like. Now, I possibly have some credibility in the object relational manager code. Like a lot of the code in certain directories, pretty much I wrote all of it. So I've highlighted various portions of commit messages here to indicate I fixed a certain problem that was basically certain joins had to be promoted to outer joins. And you can see the date here. We're way back in June. It's even early in the morning, so in theory I'm awake at this point, and I've spotted that I've actually fixed the same thing before. But I fixed it again, this time for sure. Not so much maybe. We've now moved on. I think we're a couple of days later than the previous one. Yeah, we're 2 days later. So at this point, the alarm should be going off because it's only 2 days later. Except at this point, I haven't actually realized I fixed the same problem before. And I'm saying this is something that happens. This was disguised. Time passes. There are a couple more like this in the middle. Oh, okay, I even put one in. September the 1st. You know, again, it's the same problem. If you actually look at the patches, it's the same thing. There was some I'm skipping. Finally, and I'll give you a hint, today is like the 7th of September, so you can sort of see when that is, and I've adjusted the time zone appropriately to where I was at the time. I finally cracked and thought, you know, I fixed this bug like 7 times, and I'm pretty sure I fixed it, and I'd finally twigged that I fixed this before, I'm sure. No, I fixed it over there, and there, and there. And I finally worked out, you know, there's a smell here, I've really got to fix it. Now, if someone else had done this, I'd be saying, you're just dumb, right? You should have spotted this on like time number 3. But yeah, what can I say? I'm dumb. So nothing's important here except at some point an actual method went in that was promote alias chain. That what I was basically doing was I kept just writing this line of code, promote alias, without the if statement and the must promote and everything, and it was getting things wrong. And it was subtle. It's an edge case enough that you don't notice it until you do something sufficiently complicated, and then you spend half a day working out why the idiot creating the SQL is getting it wrong. So I finally actually searched for every occurrence of promote alias. Oh, that's clearly right. And be thrown off my stride. Thank you, Jacob Kaplan-Moss. Yes. And I finally searched for every occurrence of promote alias and thought, right, most of them get this method. So, you know, don't be me. Also, know your limitations. If you're writing a patch and you think, you know, this code is terrible, I can simplify this a lot. I've got an if statement that's going if blah and blah or blah. I can chop that down to just one test. It's kind of a thing here. The wisdom of crowds is not just a really cool book title. It's kind of true. Over time, a big group of people is smarter than a small group of people or an individual. Django pretty much works. You know, all you guys are here because it pretty much works. If it sucked, there wouldn't be Django conference. So there's a pretty good chance that that code, at least at some point in its history, A, worked, or B, was inserted by somebody who wasn't high. It was actually there for a reason. So if you're simplifying something massively, why are you able to make these changes without destabilizing something else? Like this is the, be aware that you're doing something, you're probably fixing a bug, but what justifies making these changes? Sometimes, if you're, for example, refactoring query set and throwing out huge scads of code and changing it, all you're saying is, this is surely there for historical reasons. Later on, you rediscover you're entirely wrong and certain bits were there for very important reasons and you put them back in. But sometimes you can say, yes, this is clearly historical. Other times, though, you've got to be thinking, you know, there's a case that's being tested by that. What is it? Why are they ruling out that case? Why are they including that case? People will often say, there was a whole bunch of one-to-one field fixes that were patches that were around for a couple of years. And they were all doing, this fixes it perfectly for one-to-one fields. And almost invariably, someone would come along and say, yes, and breaks it for foreign keys. Because, yes, you're trying to fix the one-to-one field problem, but try not to, you know, break the rest of the code. That's where our test suite is now a lot better. It really will pick up stuff like that. But still, ask yourself, why are you justified in, if your patch removes 7 lines and replaces it with 1, what really justifies that? Was the code really so bad before that you're able to do that? You see this on a few tickets. This is obviously correct. Here is a trivial patch. Turns out this is a foreign language. It's really easy to translate, though. As soon as somebody says, this is trivial, as soon as they're thinking that, whether they write it or not, their brain turns off and they forget they're wielding this dangerous weapon called a code change. And it kind of ties into my last point. They forget that, you know, the code already pretty much worked except for their edge case. So don't go in there and just fix your case. It's almost true, though. Every time you see, here's a trivial patch, it fails the must not introduce more bugs than it fixes test. It actually puts bugs into the code for various reasons. It almost always, it's no longer trivial when they have to sit down and write a test. So you don't see tests on this is a trivial patch. And it happens in documentation patches too. I've seen documentation patches that are, this is obviously correct, I'll promote it to ready for check-in, which is one of our ticket triage stages. At that point, you can pretty much guarantee it'll be a 6-line patch and 4 of them will be wrong in various ways. They'll contain spelling errors. Like, spelling errors and grammar errors are things we can fix, but often there'll be factual inaccuracies, and that's uncool. So don't think of no patch is trivial. Every patch you're doing is for a reason, it's fixing something. That's also why tests are a good idea. It convinces you this is actually a hard thing. I should be trying to work out how to test this. That makes it sufficiently difficult that you're careful. Not everything can be fixed by writing code. In terms of, you can write code to fix the problem, but this again ties back to code mostly works. Why is it doing what it's doing? Sometimes you've got to do a little bit extra research. And we're getting towards the end here, but this is the sort of things you have to think about. I tested this patch on MySQL and it works fine. Here you go, is common. And all right, not everyone can run every database. But if you can't at least test your patch against SQLite, you're not trying. It comes with Python, right? And if you're running on Python 2.3 or 2.4, it's one download away. We run on many databases. Let's not go into why we still run on 2 Postgres backends, but we run on multiple databases. We can't test them all. I can't test Oracle. But at least think about how will this work on other databases. I'm adding some gee-whiz feature. For historical reasons, there is MySQL search operator is supported in Django. But at least at the time, they thought about how do we make this not work properly on SQLite and Postgres and things like that where it wasn't supported. If you're adding something, don't just say, there's this really cool feature in MySQL that we should use. Yeah, and we support all these databases. It's the 85% point. We're trying to hit the sweet spot. And your patch should at least be possible to apply to these other backends. Either fail gracefully, preferably, or fail clearly with a documentation patch, or, bonus points make it work. We have external backends, so you're not allowed to just say, and here's a patch for every backend. Well, you are, but you've really got to have a good reason, because at that point, we've done something consistently wrong that we probably should be making sure the people who are maintaining the MS SQL backend and the Firebird backend and the IBM DB2 backend all at least have a chance of getting the fix without too much bleeding from the eyeballs. A lot of this is do your research. MySQL documentation's online, Postgres documentation's online, SQLite documentation's online. For the really keen, SQLite and Postgres and MySQL are all open source. You can actually go and read what they do. We've been there sometimes. So separate your sort of approach to, here's a patch that works on MySQL and it looks like Postgres can do this, and it works on MySQL and SQLite. Postgres can do this, Oracle looks like it can do this, their docs are online. So convince us it's at least possible on these other ones, and maybe you haven't been able to do it, but at least it's there, because then someone else will pick it up and improve the patch. That's at least step 1. Step 2 is we have a perfect implementation. But it is possible to at least get to step 1 and be contributing usefully. You've done the research. You're not just saying, here's a fix to my problem, and I've now officially filed a ticket and a patch, and I can now abandon all care about that until it gets committed, because you're nowhere near done. Yes, you filed a bug report at that point, but you haven't really moved us towards fixing it. So filing bugs is good, by the way, but don't then come back and whine about why isn't my patch that is only working on one backend not applied. Django runs on multiple operating systems. Now, in theory, I could train wreck this together and say it runs on Windows and other. But there are still differences between them that we got to sort of watch out for a little bit. Just all you have to do here is keep in mind it runs on Windows and other. Linux and Mac are different in different ways. Some things are actually hard. It took us a lot of time to get file handling and locking and things like that working. There's been the odd commit of Django that would potentially deadlock your system. Windows file uploading had a really cool failure mode that if it couldn't save the file, it kept trying and trying and trying until your disk filled up. It would save a lot of copies of the temporary file. Really, the best way to do things with all these sort of contingencies is avoid having to do it. Either use the stuff that's already Django, or just don't do it at all. Think of a sort of lock-free algorithm type of way. Think of a way that doesn't require doing stuff that's really specialized. And it takes a bit of experience to get the point of thinking, what I'm doing is actually a little bit Unix-specific or a little bit Windows-specific. Line endings in files are a big case. If you're reading in a file and writing it back out, you've got to be thinking, that could potentially change the line endings if it wasn't created on my platform. Is that acceptable or not? Maybe it's unavoidable, but at least after a while you realize this is a bit of a risky thing, put a note in there, I don't know how to make this work on all platforms. The next best thing after don't do that is, okay, you got to do a little bit of research. And somewhere between 1 and 2, the last 2 points there, you may stop and say, just point out, look, I can't do this, someone else does the research. Again, with all the file uploading stuff and file storage stuff lately, we've had a lot of Windows bugs particularly reported, and some of them on Unix systems. File saving didn't work so well on NFS-mounted systems for a while there. We had to actually look at which error numbers were consistent between all platforms. Like, can we assume that when OS error is raised, error number 2 is always going to be raised for file does not exist? Turns out to be true. Anything above error number 43, game over, really. It varies wildly between platforms. You can get error number 10,048, I kid you not, on Windows. You're never going to see that on a Linux system. So you have to do some research. Jacob told me over just before that he actually now has a site that has those error numbers, which he's going to share with me at some point, right? Wherever he is. There are RFCs. Things like, HTTP, Atom, IRIs, URIs, all those sorts of things. We live in that universe where RFCs tend to apply. So, and although they're requests for comments, a lot of them are actually pretty much specifications of the way the world works. So you have to kind of obey them. There are also alternate specs, and Atom is a good case. There's an RFC for Atom. There's also this thing called RSS, which is not as well spec'd out, but in the real world it has a user base. There are similar things. HTTP exists, but not everyone follows it really, really carefully. We've got lots of workarounds for Internet Explorer. There's a couple of things in the code that Internet Explorer does not really understand HTTP well. So we've got some workarounds. Life's like that. We can't just say, sucks to be you, you're using Internet Explorer. We're not a framework that works for everyone then. And yeah, sometimes these are contradictory problems. You have our sympathy. We don't have a solution for that. The real world is something we cannot change. We can try and move everyone towards this, but every now and again, we can't make Django not run on AE just because it has issues. We can't make Django not run on, I don't know, something that doesn't speak UTF-8 just because it has issues. We have to accommodate things a little bit. Python is not without its own traps. I've been programming in Python now for, I don't know, 11 or 12 years or something. I still get caught by most of the things on this page. Python pickling, there are at least 2 different, pickling has a couple of different protocols. Level 0, which I think is the default, is a nice portable thing that existed in 2.3, and actually I think it existed all the way back to like 1.5. Protocol 2 was introduced in 2.3, and we use Protocol 2 when we're pickling for caches. For probably historical reasons, or we just weren't concentrating when we actually wrote the pickling there. But for whatever reason, we happen to use level 0 and 2. The difference is when you're pickling a new style class, something that inherits from object, and you're unpickling, and init does not get called with level 2. It calls get new args, a special method. You've got to read the pickling documentation here. The basic thing is, if you're trying to write something that should be pickled, you've got to remember to occasionally test it with the caching framework just to see that it unpickles. We've got a bunch of bugs lately with more people testing leading up to 1.0 saying, when I unpickle this, this thing doesn't pickle. And that's because we couldn't unpickle it properly. And it took a long time to realize that was because we were using Protocol 2. Now, at some point, I might switch. I should have maybe switched to just use Protocol 0 everywhere. But it's a little bit more verbose. I wanted to stick with 2, and we fixed those ones. Len has, oh, baby. Len is just really cool what it does. And cool is in quotes there. And this is, a lot of this is for historical reasons. Like, it has to work with old style things and new style things and operate iterators and things like that. Len swallows type error pretty much as a rule of thumb because it needs to work with things that are old style classes that aren't iterators. So there are a few bugs in Django that was like, when I do this, it raises an error. When I do count with a non-existent field, it raises an error on a query set. When I try to take the length of that, it returns 0. So this is because we were raising a type error there, and it was getting caught by length and swallowed, and it said, no list, 0. Python 2.3, and I haven't checked 2.6b3. Hopefully this will be fixed. But they reintroduced a bug from Python 2.3 that Len started swallowing all exceptions. This one's very uncool, but we catch it in our test suite. There's a test in the query set stuff that basically tries to detect infinite ordering, and it raises an exception out of the len method that we catch. It's carefully not a type error, because I'd already fallen for that mistake 2 days earlier. And it raises a different error, but 2.3 catches it, and 2.6 turns out catches it as well. We were testing 2.6 beta 2 certainly failed there. I'm not sure if beta 3 fixed it or not. It's a bug in the Python tracker. This blog entry, which is my blog, I didn't put the full URL up there, but just remember 26th of March, I wrote quite a long entry about length and iter on query sets, because it turns out when you go list of a something that's uniterable, Python calls length first to try and get an idea of how long the result should be. And we were doing things very, very slowly there. But it just, again, gives you an idea that the length method in Python is, if you're writing a length method and it's at all complicated, at least your antennae should go up, and you should just think, okay, I've got to be a little bit careful here. Test it carefully. Unicode matters. You know, this is Django. We're proud. We work everywhere. But so does UTF-8. People occasionally give me patches, particularly coming in from Europe, that only work with Unicode, and I'll adjust the test to just work with UTF-8, and they go, no, Django uses Unicode. No, Django also runs with UTF-8 and ASCII and things like that. So just be nice to the North Americans if you're not from North America. We have to, they don't use Unicode yet. Just make sure it also works with byte strings. And there are probably a few others that pop up, but they were the ones, okay, that's the list of things that messes Malcolm up. About every month or so, I'll get one of those wrong. Despite all of this, and it is a little bit depressing if, you know, a laundry list of don't do that, we still want people to contribute patches. Like, everyone's got to start somewhere. I sent my first patch to an open source project in like 1996, and the changelog is still on the web somewhere. And it's kind of cool to discover, hey, look, it's still out there, right? You got to start at the beginning. You got to send small patches in, and they'll get accepted. And hey, that's really cool. I'll try again. So don't let the fact that we come back and say, you know, this isn't quite good enough for whatever reason, or this patch, sometimes you'll get this patch is really terrible. It's not at all appropriate. We don't use the word terrible, but this is not the solution. And at that point, we'll be trying not to foam at the mouth, so we just won't write anything. But still, contribute. The best efforts of people is far better than nothing. And we much prefer an almost there effort that someone else can improve than you waiting, not submitting because you're afraid it might not be perfect. So I just want to end on a positive note. We still like patches, right? And people can get better. And if you pay attention, if you submit a patch and it gets committed, check what went into the change set, because it may not be exactly your patch, and you can maybe learn something from why it was different. Anyway, that's it. Any questions? Happy to answer. No questions. Cool. Let's go. Oh, not you again. Every talk.
Your last note there reminded me of something. If anyone's looking for a pet project, I think it would be really cool if our track system automatically emailed the contributor of the patch with, oh, thanks for contributing. Here's what we actually ended up doing, and like a diff of the diff or something, you know, and maybe an optional way for one of the core committers to actually give you notes on that. So if anyone's interested, come see me. I'd love to talk about it.
Okay, clap for Malcolm again.